Thomas Wild. I teach in the German Studies program and am research director here at the Arendt Center. I'm very excited about this event tonight or this afternoon, and to welcome our guests of honors, Elisabeth Lenk and Rita Bischof, with whom I share a publisher, which is very nice.
And some problems with this publisher.
Oh, yeah. Where's the author who doesn't have a problem with, with the publisher? I wish. But Matthes and Seitz is in a way was one of the publishers who early on had an open door for surrealist writings, the original publisher. And some of the newer books that Rita Bischof, for example, published, their Tragic Laughter and Sovereignty and Subversion, very highly recommended, as much as Elisabeth Lenk's early publications in that publishing house. And if there needs to be another reason for you to study German, here are books you would be able to read after you did it.
We had dinner the other night with someone, a very interesting writer, a translator, Mark Palisotti is his name, and he wrote to me after our dinner that he decided he wants to learn German.
Oh, good.
So he should be then your example.
Okay, good. I was going to say, despite the fact that Susan is sort of subverting that by her providing the translation, but I think in a dialectical sense you're actually inspiring reading the original by opening non-native speakers or non-German speakers so far a pathway to these wonderful writings. And so this is also a celebration of translation, I think, this afternoon. I'll turn it over to Susan Gillespie, who will say a few words about Elisabeth Lenk and Rita Bischof, and after that Samantha Helge will give a presentation, after which we will open it up to your questions and to a conversation.
Yeah, I think it's lovely to have you all come here to have the chance to have a really informal conversation and a chance to speak to two people who know from their own experience a lot about this world. The word surrealism seems to be coming back into use more and more frequently to describe the world that we live in. And I wanted to start by saying that surrealism really came about as a child of war, after the First World War and after the Algerian War, and during the Algerian War, of course, and during and after the Second World War. And in the resonances of this world of ours today, where war seems to be everywhere, and more proliferating, even though undeclared. I think that might be one of the reasons why surrealism again and again comes back into our consciousness as something that maybe we should be more aware of. I just want to say a few more words about Elisabeth and Rita, because they are too modest to mention much of their own publications. If you want to, and I had one of the wonderful things about doing a book like this is that you get to know the people. Yeah, I mean that's the real payoff in a way. If I sell some books, it's very nice, and somebody, of course, will get to read more about this. Some people, but for me personally, it was a great chance to get to know Elisabeth and Rita. Elisabeth's books include Unbewusste Gesellschaft, Unconscious Society, and Kritische Fantasie, Critical Imagination. She was a professor, among other places, at the University of Hanover, and assistant at the Peter Szondi Institute. If you don't know Peter Sondi's name, S-Z-O-N-D-I, and you're interested in German, make a note. He's a very interesting thinker and a real democrat among Germanists, I would say. In 1962, Elisabeth decided to move to Paris. She was then already Adorno's doctoral student. And but it was as a result, really, of her political activism that she got to know the Surrealists. Elisabeth was a leading member, I would say, of German SDS, which, although the letters stand for something else, is the same thing as American SDS, basically, left student movement. She had recently given the keynote lecture at one of their national conferences, and she was in touch with deserters from the war in Algeria. And it's through this connection that she came to meet with the Surrealists in Paris. And was invited, I think, quite unusually as a German, and became the sort of expert for German things among the Surrealists, I'm told. But she did continue throughout this period. She persuaded Adorno, remarkably enough, to allow her to write her dissertation on surrealism, which she did. And there are a lot of interesting things in the correspondence. Correspondence is what forms the core of this book. It's where it started. It started with this volume, which includes the correspondence and some other some other essays by Elisabeth, including one which is in the new book, which is called Critical Theory in Surreal Practice, which is a particularly important essay, I think, of hers, written after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it takes up again this question: does surrealism have something politically and artistically to say to us now? Rita Bischof is Elisabeth's student.
No, not really.
No?
No, not really. I met her after I...
Not formally.
I knew her after
No, I have read your book about André Breton, Der springende Narziss. And then I moved to Berlin to study with you. But she stayed only 1.5 years when I came, and then she
not in
went back to Paris.
I did not want to leave, but it's very strong in Germany. My years was passé.
First time she's
Yeah, it was
sure.
So, well, not a student in a very formal sense, but certainly from that, or some impressions from that early period. Rita went on to become a celebrated and much published expert on surrealism. She has the most amazing library on surrealism. It's a pleasure just to go and look at the shelves, frankly. But Rita studied philosophy, sociology, and literature in Frankfurt, Marburg, and Berlin, and taught at various places. As she said, she's written on Georges Bataille, but also a lot of Benjamin. I think Benjamin, in a way, almost more than Adorno, is the key figure here intellectually. When she agreed to write the introduction to this book, which is also translated here in the new volume, and is an important document, again, making this argument that, that surrealism is not without relevance for this moment.
Nadia.
Yes.
I wasn't quite finished.
It's
very
important.
important.
She will speak about
most important.
Yes, her most recent book, Nadia Revisited. Nadia Revisited includes the letters and drawings of Leonard Delcourt, who was the Nadia of Breton's famous book. And it's a beautiful book. We hope that we will get it translated into English soon. But it really gives Nadia her due as a person and as an artist. It has many of her illustrations in it, and it's an important...
all her drawings and all her letters are autographs. They are known.
Yeah, a very important contribution, I think, to the scholarship and the awareness of who Nadia herself was. Rita, I'll quote a moment for her from her, maybe I won't, because I think you were going to quote from your essay. Maybe today, read a little bit from it. We're making this up as we go along. But this volume had a long evolution. For those of you who write books or are interested in having things published, it's kind of an interesting story. Maybe it's not that unusual, but it ended up quite different from the way it began. It began as a translation of this book about honoring Elisabeth Lenk, a person who's much too little known in English, and it was to include quite a few other essays of yours, not all of which made it into the final volume. But as the original editor and I thought about it more, the subject of surrealism came, and the response to surrealism came more and more into the foreground of our thought. And so, among other things, and this was important to me also as the translator, we included some other documents, important documents, key documents of surrealism, both from Adorno's writing. He has an essay on surrealism called Surrealism Revisited. He has some kind of descriptive pieces which he thought of as surrealist pieces originally. And then we retranslated Adorno's essay, as I said, but also Benjamin's important and really famous, key, I would say, essay on surrealism, the last snapshot of the European intelligentsia. So that's how the book came to have this title. And 9 years later, I'm happy that we can present it to you.
Oh, audience applause. Okay, so thank you so much, Susan, for bringing this event together and bringing these two wonderful speakers. I can't encourage strongly enough. Everyone should buy the book from Susan. I think she has a box of them in her car.
It's true.
It's absolutely beautiful to read, and it's a brilliantly compiled volume, which I want to talk a little bit about. So I've organized some thoughts on reflections on reading the book. That I will offer to kind of start the conversation with a number of questions peppered throughout. But I want to start by showing you a film. So I'm really happy that you started by saying that, you know, surrealism really was the child of the First World War, and in many ways we can't wholly separate surrealism from war and the impulse of war and the violence of the society that we live in. And so I want to start there and kind of end on a note there. So it's a short film. It's 4 minutes, black and white, silent. It's evening. People are having dinner or a drink with a friend or intimate. Pleasure of wine, food. The restaurant is not full. It's quiet enough to talk. But after a few seconds, there's a large blast. Objects begin flying through the air, a kind of confetti or snow, people running. Tables move. A man with a large machine aims it at the ground. He walks away. A woman unseen emerges and takes off in the other direction. 2 strangers beneath the flurry hold on to one another. We watch the same scene unfold several times, each time from a different angle.
Verstehst du ein bisschen? Soll ich übersetzen? Das ist die Restaurantszene hier aus Paris.
Wo dann irgendjemand, wir müssen sehen.
Was?
This is a long 4 minutes.
cover appears surreal, and yet it is not. It's obviously footage from the shootings that happened in Paris last Friday. This morning we awoke to more news of horror. What will another night of sleep bring? The ghastly light of day obscures our vision so that we can barely see, barely look at the violence that surrounds us. Surrealism itself, Lenk writes, can be viewed as the effort to break up the darkness of the present, admittedly at the cost of sundering not only the world, but the eye that observes it as well. And so I want to ask, at first, how do we resist the temptation to not wither under the weight of this immediacy? Occasionally, we have the great pleasure to talk about the book. We have the great pleasure of feeling intoxicated while reading, and I'm happy to say that reading this volume had such an effect on me. Set against the backdrop of Adorno and Benjamin's disagreements over the dialectical image, Bischof's and Lenk's essays are an invitation to think about the on-again, off-again relationship between critical theory and surrealism. The correspondence between Lenk and Adorno reveals a different side of Adorno, one that is softer and perhaps more sympathetic than we would have otherwise thought him to be. Moving through the correspondence, though, I was unprepared for her notes, which at first I mistook for a kind of critical annotation, and indeed in many respects they are, but I was struck by the act of remembering, made visible, the encountering of oneself or former self, and the excursions about meetings and references made in the letters, but otherwise invisible to the readers. We not only get to read the letters, but we get to reread them, as Lenk recalls the details of each. In her essay, Critical Theory and Surreal Practice, she asks us whether surrealism was and is not precisely the practice that is appropriate to critical theory, and whether critical theory was and is not precisely the theory toward which surreal practice was oriented. This question provides a framework for thinking about the relationship between the Frankfurt School tradition of critical thought and surrealism. There are three brokers of this romance that appear in the book. The first, as suggested in the text, in which I hope we can talk about, is Bataille. And then, of course, the other two are Lenk and Bischof. According to Lenk, the Frankfurters and the Surrealists sought to add a new dimension to the political, in her terms. This new dimension may be nothing but the philosophical cave in which they were able to immerse themselves, she writes, under the pressure of contemporary problems, and from which they regularly re-emerged with the solution, an always surprising solution which they could not have arrived at by mechanically applying conceptual apparatuses. The cave is the dark cave of the unconscious, and one that does not take place in the destructive light of day, but is created from the inner darkness and consists in producing images that come from the nocturnal realm. It is a process of thinking. When I read these lines, I immediately thought of what Lenk refers to as a kind of ecstatic dancing in one of her letters to Adorno between the sensuous object and the concept. Free, we are able to immerse ourselves in this so-called philosophical cave and emerge from it, having abandoned conscious trains of reasoning to the debris of our own psyche, which we must also pay attention to. Taking this to heart, I saw two themes emerge in the letters that seem to add to or facilitate this dimension or process of thinking. Happiness as eroticism. At one point, Lenk writes in her essay that for Adorno, happiness is eroticism. And a politics of refusal. In Breton's 1924 manifesto, the first manifesto, he tells us that the only true universalism is eroticism. In Benjamin's essay, Surrealism, he describes Breton and Nadia. Breton and Nadia are the lovers who convert everything we have, experiences, on melancholy train rides, on God-forsaken Sunday afternoons, in the proletarian districts of the big cities. They bring the powerful forces of atmosphere concealed inside these things to explosion. There is a romantic obsessive encounter in Nadia. The back and forth of Breton's ecstatic trying to understand her, she who always seems to be slipping away from him, or called to the blow of kisses of passers-by marveling at her aura. "I am annoyed," he says. "I suppose I observe her too much, but how can I help it? How does she regard me? How does she judge me? It is unforgivable of me to go on seeing her if I do not love her. Don't I love her?" Breton writes that he is closer to the objects Nadia is close to than her herself. These objects become the threshold images that lead one to the profane epiphany, as Benjamin calls it. In such a state of maddening love, in this intoxication is the element of the revolutionary act. And for Benjamin, the representation, this maddening representation, is also the anarchic impulse of surrealism. It also, I think, echoes the carefully drawn-out distinction he makes in the epistemo-critical prologue between knowledge and truth, where knowledge is always trying to possess, whereas truth is always fleeing before the lover, fleeing before eros, and the lover of truth is always in pursuit. In this way, the practice of surrealism dismantles what Benjamin calls the mosaic in that text. It forces us to break with the mundane, rational trains of thought that act like totalitarian forces in our everyday lives, that command us without engaging us in thinking. The objects Benjamin details disrupt the cognitive ordering and associations, where we encounter the object differently when we are intoxicated. But if desire in this way, maddening, if desire always leads us back to the self, who am I, Breton asked in the first line of Nadia, then can this be a political gesture, a collective political gesture? Benjamin, wary of humanisms, as he tells us at the beginning of The Origin of German Tragic Drama, finds in surrealism a counter-movement to the staleness of the intelligentsia, the left-wing intelligentsia, and their stagnant notion of a humanist freedom. In the same stroke, Benjamin is wary of the moralistic images of politics, and Susan writes about this very nicely in her preface, and the metaphors they wallow in. So how do we unmask the moralistic metaphor in politics, when today it seems as if we stepped into what I think seems to be a kind of Kantian wonderland that constantly turns our gaze, more so our hands, towards the immediacy of so-called political action, the need to do something? Adorno, contra Benjamin, fails to see the disruptive potential of surrealism in the same way. Lacking the sensuous or materialist sensibility to understand the dialectical image as it flashes forth, he seems to reduce, in his essay, surrealism to its methodologies, which, as Benjamin rightly notes, are not methods at all, but rather tricks and games. For Adorno, the montages of surrealism are still lifes, stillborn images that compose a kind of necropolis devoid of sensory detours, which might otherwise free us from the tyranny of the empirical world. For him, the real and political absence of meaning can be found in the cold ahistorical process, modern modes of production, and attempts to derive meaning or political revolutionary energy or revolt to refuse, for him, cannot be found in the material artifacts of this phenomenal world, even in those objects he claims are dead. But it is precisely these objects of refuse that allow us, Benjamin argues, to call attention to the cross-grain and do the work of historical materialism. It is these images, these dialectical images, and I think surreal images, that flash of lightning that illuminate. It is here in these dialectical images where we find our power to enact a weak messianism, disrupting the normative order of things and the onslaught of historicism. For Adorno, the image is nothing more than a photograph, hearkening to a nostalgic remembrance of a time when we were a different self, calling together the present and our past with future hopes. Lenk, I think more sympathetic to Benjamin than Adorno, tells us that surrealism can break up the darkness of the present. It makes visible thought that obscures itself in the act of thinking, she says. It's a new thinking, a thinking capable of looking horror in the eye, of confronting the present reality, unwilling to be subdued by logics of salvation or hope, or petty bourgeois morality, and those springtime poems we know oh so well. It is rather a new thinking that emerges from the refuse and one that refuses. A refusal to simply accept the world as it is, credit it for being good somehow, or go on believing that anything today could, quote, be harmless or neutral anymore. And can we? When each morning we wake to new horrors, mass killings, violence on a scale so grand that each day is constantly proving the event is the exception to the rule. There is no exception to the rule in Benjamin's terms. The exception is the rule. Adorno isn't wholly unsympathetic to surrealism, though, which I was happily surprised by. And there are affinities between his understanding of political action as a form of critical thinking and the practices of surrealism. And it is here in the notion of a refusal that Adorno, I think, can be helpful. If Benjamin is our champion of the erotic impulse, then the more measured tone of Adorno can help us understand the political gesture of surrealism as a refusal. In his lectures on moral philosophy, he writes, that something should be done is a belief held by everyone nowadays. What is found to be problematic is when someone decides not to do anything for once, but to retreat from the dominant realm of practical activity in order to think about something essential. Adorno's provocation to stop acting and to think, thinking as a form of action in itself, is a negative claim that has political power to be disruptive, to prevent, stave off violence, perhaps. To equip us with a new trick or game for thinking about the world and how we interact with ourselves, people, and objects in the world. Without any desire to command morally, it seems perhaps we can make ourselves available to new forms of thinking, and should. It is the sense and observation of blind action, as he calls it in one of his letters to Lenk, of the SDS members that alienated from him and made him critical of the movement. It was this blind action and joiner mentality that he was wary of. For Adorno, we must refuse to be joiners and instead turn to thought, and not just in everydayness, but also in our academic undertakings. In Lenk's essay, she talks about her and Adorno's shared love of literature. She writes, literature, and she's referring to one of the letters she wrote him, literature freed from the constraints of academic drudgery, choking on its own self-constructed conceptuality, offers the philosopher a chance to breathe. Quote, the person who comes from a philosophy and would like to escape it first grasps the isolated sensual object until he notices that there is no such thing as an isolated sensual object, that it exists as such only in its being different from the concept. This revelation is so thrilling, she writes, that the philosopher begins to dance between the sensual thing and the concept. Concepts and categories are the systematized methodologies of the philosophers and theorists. If Adorno breaks free from this prison of concepts and categories, I think he does so in Minima Moralia, where he writes, dialectical thought is an attempt to break through the coercion of logic by its own means. Since it must use these means, it is at every moment in danger of itself acquiring a coercive character. The ruse of reason would like to hold sway over the dialectic, too. The danger of the coercion of logic is systematization, which looks like a form of critical dialectic, but perhaps functions like a methodology, reinforcing the logic of domination it's trying to defeat. Surrealism as a practice can help us subvert the ruse of reason with its tricks. It reveals the real functioning of thought, and in certain forms, perhaps eroticism or refusal, the dialectical possibilities of the surrealist image. Breton, after all, refused to be a joiner, declaring his right not to serve in the war in Algeria, calling for desertion, to not participate in the violence of the now, the violence that is always striking each second of every day. I think that there's so much to be said about this book, and I'll just add one quick note. I was a little hesitant to draw clear lines between Benjamin and Adorno, because I think that they can both be helpful to understanding how critical theory kind of informs real practice, but in different ways. So I tried to focus on the ways in which they can help instead of the differences.
It's but you have said really everything what is important. That is important in the discussion we have, how to combine critical theory or how to realize critical theory in the form of practice. This is a question, sure, we are confronted with, I think, in every time, in every epoch, also today, but it's I can't, my English is not so good that I could answer. What would you say, Elisabeth? Wie war kritische Theorie und mit dem Surrealismus verbunden? War sie mit ihm verbunden? Haben wir nur die Verbindung hergestellt, weil wir von beiden angesprochen waren? Ja.
Was meinst du?
Die Verbindung von kritischer Theorie und surrealer Praxis.
Würdest du nicht sagen,
Ja,
es war doch wichtig, war auch
yeah, it
für
was.
dich wichtig.
Yeah, because surrealism is a movement, an art movement, but not only an art movement. It was always a political. It was always politically inspired. And from the very beginning, because as everybody mentioned, it was born during the First World War, and the world in which the surrealism appeared was a destroyed world, if you want, and the world we awake was also a destroyed world in a way. And therefore, I think there is a connection, a strong connection.
I might say that I think there's even a third dimension, which is that for the surrealists, there was never a strict separation between public and private.
No.
But the implications of that lack of separation were very different from what we see today. And that's where I think your comments about the sort of self-defeating logic of logic and words and systems and so forth is a problem. Yeah, that we have less and less privacy, as the Arendt Center has eloquently made clear.
And Benjamin emphasized this lack of privacy when he came back from the USSR. He was fascinated by people living without doors to close, with always open doors. For me, it is a nightmare to live in such a place where I couldn't shut up my door. But
then we have this restaurant with obviously 4 surveillance cameras going all the time, even when there's not a terrorist attack, right?
Yeah. But there's no recept to how to translate theory in practice. It was a question we discussed at the epoch, in the epoch is at 68 during the student revolt. But didn't we find an answer? No.
Yes, it was. Friends, very young friends, disappeared. Very big.
Well,
No, es gibt die jungen Freunde, die plötzlich tot waren. Alle.
Yeah, it was.
Welche Freunde?
Ja, wen meinst du jetzt? Weiß ich auch nicht.
Ja, ich dachte, unsere Freunde, die plötzlich starben, und zwar, woran? Am AIDS.
Ah, nein, das ist später.
Ja, ach so.
No, yeah, I would say the surrealist practice would concern in would consist in enlarging the spaces of freedom steadily, constantly, and yeah.
But also drawing on sides of ourselves that we constantly deny, right?
Yeah, or
we channel them into very narrow, forms of action.
And to think by our own, to think independently from what we have been taught.
Können Sie etwas darüber sagen, wie der Surrealismus auf den Zweiten Weltkrieg und auf den Holocaust reagiert hat? Was hat er damit gemacht? What did Surrealism do with the Second World War and the Holocaust? How did it react to that?
Some surrealists have been resistance. For example, Robert Desnos, who's almost unknown today, or even Paul Eluard was also took part on the French resistance against the National Socialism. But Breton went to the United States, and he lived a little bit apart because he refused to speak English, a single word. He lived here for 5 years and he didn't speak English, one single word in English. He always, he only met the other exiles and or American people who by chance spoke French, as for example Maya Shapiro. He was,
Il jouait.
Yeah, il jouait. No, this was waiting on in Marseille when they waited for the overship.
Yeah. But Elisabeth says something important here, which is the word play, right? There's an element of play always, even with this great seriousness.
There are some statements about the Second World War. Because, for example, Breton gave a conference in Yale in 1942, and this conference is really a political one. And there he was confronted with young students of the French. They soon would have been sent to the Second World War, and it was the same situation in which he lived 25 years ago in etwa. Yeah. And there he was, but he was really concerned with language, because Surrealists believed that to change the world you have to change the language first. Not that this is their kind of revolution. It's not a revolution with weapons and system changes should become by a different language, by reflecting language and what language is doing. Yeah, I could read some because I translated some of the sentences, some of this speech he gave in Yale. It's not this. Maybe it's just to give you an impression how they saw the situation during the First World War. But it's not, no, there are no really. It was Georges Bataille who was one of the first to mention the concentration camps in 1947 already, and at the same time as Adorno and Horkheimer, Dwight MacDonald here in the United States, and they have been, for a long time, they have been the first and only intellectual speaking about what really happened during the Second World War. But no, maybe if you want, I can read you some of what Breton said about the importance of, or the significance of language for
This would be an example for Breton's surrealist practice.
Yeah, I think it was more a literary practice and then a real practice. But in the beginnings, there we have they made the scandals, lots of scandals, but and to draw the attention to the movement, I think. But then they have been concerned with art questions and with questions of the language. It's because, yeah. I don't know if it is.
Lies was. Lies doch bitte was.
Yeah. Yeah, it is here. I can. Maybe, yeah. Yeah, it is a characteristic for the impact history of Surrealism that for a long time its notion had been used almost exclusively to describe a certain artistic tendency in modern paintings, whereas the Surrealist literature remained widely unknown. Only small and elitist circles are familiar with the basic text. Yet it needs to be said that Surrealism as an artistic movement had been born out of the spirit of modern poetry. Words are its reality because André Breton, Louis Aragon and Philippe Soupeau, the Three Musketeers, as they have been called due to their light-blue uniforms, were poets. The fact that they emphasized from the very beginning the notion of image is no contradiction to this thesis, for they spoke about a mere literary image, about an image that cannot be seen, that is not visible from the outside, but only audible from the inside. In other words, the image had to be perceived by the ear, and of course it deals with the subject's inner self. The reason behind is that Surrealism in its origin was a dispute exclusively with language, and Breton referred to it in its different books and essays. Already in the second Dada manifesto one can read, generally we are considered to be poets because we are engaged into language, which is the worst convention of all. And in the second manifesto of Surrealism, Breton wrote, Surrealism faces a problem of expression in all its forms, and who speaks about expression speaks first and foremost about language. And in 1953, more distinctly, today everybody knows that Surrealism has had its origin in a broad action aiming at language. For the young poets, language, as it had been taught, had become a problem because it sketches an image of the world that is based on ideological premises or presuppositions. Breton spoke about a certain tendency of the world steadily to rebuild the world according to the same patterns. All happens as if there were an objective reality out of the individuals who grasp it and to swap ideas on it amongst themselves. He was convinced that the one who wants to change the world has first to change the language. And he asked, what prevents me to destroy the order of words, and if it were only to demonstrate that there is no reality independent of its apprehension by man. There is no language and no perspective that could represent the world exactly as it is. In the contrary, language and the consciousness of reality are so deeply intertwined that there is no means by which they could be separated from each other. Therefore, the clarification of their relationship was of high relevance for modern avant-gardists. Breton suspected that the mediocrity of our world arises from the mediocrity of the forms in which we express it. During his exile in 1942, he gave a conference at Yale in front of an audience of young students who soon would be sent into the Second World War, just as he was more than 25 years ago after he had finished school. He said analogously that one day the 20th century would be recognized as a verbal nightmare or as a delirious cacophony. More is spoken than ever before. Just imagine the radio stations that can't keep silence, that calculate the word within seconds, no matter if anybody will be listening or not, if there is something that had to be said or not. In the mind of Breton, the 20th century had been the time of an immense prostitution of the word. Surrealists were profoundly convinced of the intent on total emancipation of the mind, and that's the point. Surrealists were profoundly convinced of the intent on a total emancipation of the world, and that's the point. I don't think it's a sentence very good, but can sum up its force only through language. That's why the revolution of the poetry became a paradigm. It necessarily had to precede any radical political change. In the search of a new language, the Surrealists were not the first. They followed in the footsteps of Arthur Rimbaud and Guillaume Apollinaire. And then, Surrealism started with the experiment with the automatic writing, I would say, and this was already in 1919, after they were released by the army. Yeah, or they have been released by the army. Yeah, and so.
Weiter.
Yeah, I was wondering if anyone, you've all mentioned the connections between war and surrealism, and I wonder if any of you have a sense of specific strategies that the surrealists used in their work, either in writing or in visual art, that make sense of that, or are there things that you see they're doing as opposed to what other schools, as opposed to what Impressionists are doing, or Dadaists, or Abstractionists, or so things that are specific to the practice of surrealism that help us to understand that link between war and surrealism.
Ob es da besondere Beispiele gibt, also wie die Surrealisten mit dieser Verbindung zwischen Krieg und Praxis da,
Yeah, I could. Because Breton had the intent to study medicine, and therefore he was trained as assistant doctor during the First World War, and he had to do with soldiers suffering under the post-traumatic stress disorder, and maybe there is a link to practice, because he practiced for the first time the methods of Freud, of the psychoanalysis, with his patients. And one day after the war, he decided he decided to practice the same methods with himself, and they made the experience of the automatic writing. He and Philippe Soupeau, because Aragon, he wasn't not yet released from the army at the time. He was still in the Rhineland, and And this was a change. I think it's a tipping point of modern literature, because it's a kind of literature without any intent. There's no rational or subjective intent. They wrote what ever was passing through their mind in the moment, and with a certain fastness,
Rapidity, yeah.
Rapidity, yeah. He even sketched a tableau of the different velocities they reached in their texts, and but at the same time, Breton, who couldn't he was whereas Philippe Soupeau didn't correct his texts. Breton was always correcting.
Manipuler un peu.
Oui,
But what about
I'm so tired.
Rita? What about in these, and Elisabeth? What about in these automatic texts and so forth? The role of the social. That they were part of a group, and these experiments I think often took place together, right?
Yeah,
Or required
yeah,
more than one person.
Required more
It's
than one
always
person.
a
So
group
that's different,
inspiration,
perhaps,
yeah.
than how we might think about poetic language, would be the access to this kind of language.
I think also part of what you were touching on, the connection for me part of the connection I see is this resistance and refusal to allow oneself to simply be puppeted by just acting blindly, right? By not engaging in the thinking process actively. And in this form of, in the exquisite corpse games and in the automatic grading games, there is this poetic notion of receptivity and being the kind of fertile ground where the thoughts appear and flow freely, which is the opposite of domination. Whereas the application of conceptual categories in philosophy, right, control and end up, right, that ruse of reason, they end up reinforcing the logic of domination of war that the Surrealist practices undermine, I think.
Yeah, let me say something about that because I think it's relevant to today. Is that I think the Surrealists saw in these practices a way to really connect imaginative with the other.
Yeah.
So there was not, some absolute inability or incapacity to imagine and to more than empathize with, to really kind of be a part of another consciousness or another situation.
Ich fragte mich vor allem, ob Sie uns einen Blick oder vielleicht Sie beide uns geben können in Ihre surrealistischen Praktiken. Sozusagen in Arbeitspraktiken, die Ihre Arbeit sozusagen.
Yeah, Elisabeth was a really political person in the early 60s. She supported the French draft resistor at the time of the Algerian War.
Yeah, deserters.
These deserters who came to Frankfurt, and she brought them, and she kept the contact to their families and friends, and she brought them the material as typing machines and so on, and messages. She went from Frankfurt to Paris and always with some messages in her pocket, and so she came to the Surrealist movement in a moment when she divorced. She decided not to become Adorno's assistant, but to go to Paris, and there she met Joseph Pierre, he is a well-known surrealist, and he introduced her to Breton. And so there was another history beginning. Yeah, surrealists have always been political aware, I would say. And from the very beginning till the Algerian War, because Breton died in '66. And he was one of the first who, there was a declaration of the 121 against the war and in Algeria.
They were not
But
allowed
in
to.
America he was paralyzed. Breton was like paralyzed completely. It was not there haven't been any activity. So he worked at least on the for the Office of War Information, but this was all he did. So. Yeah.
Yeah, in the history of surrealism, as it is typically written, it seems like the end of the Second World War was the demise of Breton and his group, and this was the moment in which the existentialists, right, arose and said, the surrealists are over there playing their parlor games, and we're the ones that are being serious about this tragedy that just befell all of Europe. And the questions of personal responsibility and everything that came up with the existentialists. Of course, Sartre, has this essay in which he completely tears down the surrealist project as being superficial and the games, not in the way you described them as connecting with the other, but as being completely disconnected from this tragic reality. And I've worked on Latin American surrealists who came along in the second wave, very many of them, in Paris in the 60s or 70s, and wanting to renew this movement, and indeed renewing it. There are surrealist groups all over Latin America to this day. So, but I just wanted to ask you about that. There seems to be such a battle still going on in the literature over, is surrealism dead? Or, what is it that was able to survive the Second World War? Were Sartre's critiques of the surrealists as superficial game players fair, unfair? And this battle kind of is still going on. I just wondered if either of you had any thoughts about surrealism and this metaphor of death, the cadaver, and the cadaver that arises from the grave. This keeps coming up over and over in things that I read and things that I've written. Yeah, so I don't know if you have any comments.
Yeah, you have mentioned the relationship between existentialism and surrealism, but there was a really bad essay written by Sartre just after the war about engaged literature, and he
Pretended?
He pretended to have invented the literary engagement, but this is not true. And there was a big struggle, and even Bataille, who was always in conflict with Breton, or Breton was in conflict with him, decided not to write in the modern time, the temps moderne, the genre of edited by Sartre, because of this denunciations, I would say, of surrealists. And Sartre was the one who kept was a conqueror of the scene for a few years only. For a few years, because looked from today, what was happened after the Second World War in France. Existentialism doesn't play the role it seemed to play in the 50s. And surrealism isn't really dead. It isn't bygone. It is always there is it's like how can you there is it's historical constant, historical constant on it, and in all these conflicts of today, there are artists that are underlining the importance that surrealism had to express what they experienced.
I found in a book by Marianne Cause a term that she borrows from Bachelard, surrationalism, which might be something that we need now. To overcome this rationalism this fake rationalism or super rationalism that we're talking about, where, for example, everything is translated into dollars and cents, and increasing wealth is the only thing that's worth striving for, that kind of thing. Yes.
And I think there's in the book there's the conversation about whether or not surrealism is dead is present, and there's this emphasis that we have to, surrealism is about the present, what Benjamin calls the Jetztzeit, or, the now, and, I think it's somewhat symptomatic of our own kind of academically trained thinking to ask if it's dead, then what do we do with it? How do we know it? How do we talk about it? How do we historicize it? And I think surrealism challenges us to break free.
I think there's something else that plays a big role in the weakening and the failures of surrealism, as well as of existentialism, is of course what was going on in the Soviet Union and among the communist parties and so forth, right? A lot of people went down that road, right? And that road is no longer available, so maybe it's another reason for surrealism to come back in a way, because the temptation of, world communism is no longer available.
One of the interesting historical facts that I love to remember is that Breton was one of the earliest ones to denounce Stalin in 1938, before that had become, a generally accepted.
Yeah, but it was already Bataille in the early 30s already, because he was a member of the group founded by Boris Souvarin, Russian. And he was the one who wrote the first book about Stalin, and they have been really on the hostile to what was happening in the USSR. But Breton at the time was still looking for the Anerkennung, for the recognition of the Communist Party, whereas Bataille never was seduced by the movement, by the political party.
Susan, can you say something about how the title came to be for this collection?
Yeah, it came to our mind one day. Because, because surrealism, one of the things about surrealism, and I always think back to its origins or its predecessor in Dada, right? Which, if you go around the world, I keep finding Dada everywhere, actually. They talk about surrealism, what I really find is Dada most of the time. But the idea was to be a provocation, right? And we need some provocations of a smart kind, I think. Because everything, otherwise becomes kind of boring and hopeless. Except, we have this, romance with apocalypse, which is also not acceptable in the end. So what are you going to do? Maybe be provocative. And so the idea challenged that there's something about this movement and about this way of thinking that challenges us to think differently about our own situation.
I had the impression, I don't know much of Adorno on this, but I had the impression that there was also the suggestion, just from what's been said, that it was also Surrealism's challenge to Adorno, in a sense, that it was, and in a way, maybe...
Maybe it was Elisabeth's
Elizabeth-
challenge
It
to
was
Adorno.
Elizabeth's her challenge
Yes.
to Adorno.
Actually,
Yes,
and I was
that's true.
I was wondering if you
It's
could say
Of course,
something
true.
about that, more about why Adorno, Elisabeth, maybe you might want to say something about why Adorno resisted Surrealism. What did he not like about it?
Because he had his literary taste was really conservative.
Ja.
Yeah.
Sie können auch Deutsch sprechen und dann wir übersetzen das.
Ja.
Ja, das ist vielleicht besser.
Ja, bitte.
Schön, sehr schön. Ja, da würde ich würde selber da ein Fragezeichen machen, ob er wirklich irgendwie in der Resistance sowieso nicht war, aber auch nicht, nicht gegen irgendwelche reaktionären Sachen in Deutschland hat er nicht viel gemacht.
Aber auch
Wer jetzt?
gegen den
Adorno.
oder ja, die Frage war vielleicht mehr, also warum war er so zurückhaltend gegenüber dem Surrealismus?
Ach du, das
He
hat mich
didn't,
gar nicht
he
interessiert.
didn't,
Hat mich nie interessiert.
It didn't interest him.
Aber warum nicht, weiß ich nicht. Nie.
Wow.
He was interested in Elizabeth.
Er hatte höchstens
He
manchmal
didn't know
gesagt,
Surrealism.
Sie sind die schönste Surrealistin, ne? Aber das lag nur daran, dass er damals so ziemlich da auf mich abgefahren war. Aber es hatte überhaupt nichts mit einer Überzeugung von Adorno zu tun. Ne? Im Gegenteil.
He called her the most beautiful
Nee, das war
surrealist.
wirklich, also, und der
That was the extent of his interest.
no, yeah.
But he was interested in Beckett, right? So
Yeah, sure.
Oh ja,
Ja,
ja, zum Beispiel
Beckett
nicht.
Ja.
ist
Ganz was
kein
anderes.
Surrealist, aber,
Oh, ja, nee.
aber er war nicht ganz konservativ, deswegen ist
It's
es...
true.
And also, Samantha, you drew out some of his interest in the methodology, this negation or refusal.
Well, I think that Adorno can be helpful if our challenge is to understand the relationship between critical theory and surreal practice. There's no question that Benjamin is our sympathetic figure, but I don't think that means that we have to cast off Adorno entirely. And if we look at his work around thinking and political action, I think we see this gesture of refusal, which is very present in surrealism. And it's, Adorno was not sympathetic to, surrealism, but I don't think that means he was wholly unsympathetic, and perhaps we have Elisabeth to thank for that and kind of brokering the relationship, but, I think that aspect of it emerges in the correspondence, and it's just I was building that bridge.
I think that the idea of the determinate negation leaves room for something else to emerge, right? And it's not something that Adorno ever chooses, as far as I know, very much to explore. But the possibility remains, that you oppose not everything. It's not a complete rejection, but a rejection of specific things, and in identifying those specific things, you maybe leave room for other things to emerge. Yeah.
And I think
And if you read the aesthetic theory of Adorno, you will find that there is another stance towards surrealism than in his essay from 53. I think it was written in 53 or 56. I don't know exactly here. And this may be due to Elizabeth's. Oh ja, why not?
Ja, meinst du doch?
Ja.
Aber er hat ja ihre Dissertation gelesen, oder?
Nein, nicht mehr.
Nein? Nein? Ach so.
Ja, die war ja, das war nun wieder mein Pech, dass ich so gerne in Frankreich war, dass ich immer nicht fertig wurde.
Ja, das
She's
kenne ich.
unfortunately
Ich war
she
nicht
was embarrassed so much that she didn't want to finish
als
her
Adorno
dissertation.
schon tot
Ach
war.
so.
in the last letter, Gretel asked how the dissertation is coming. There's horrible flashbacks. But he was working on aesthetic theory, and she says that she would ask you for help in finishing the volume.
Ja.
Well, yeah, so.
Was sagt sie jetzt?
Ach, die ästhetische Theorie ist ja fragmentarisch geblieben. Ne? Sie ist ja gar nicht von ihm mehr bis zum Ende, weil er sie ja immer überarbeitet und nochmal
Ja, das
überarbeitet und so
ist
weiter.
wahr, das ist sehr richtig, ja.
Und dass sie auf dich, das war Gretel, aber nicht Adorno, Gretel,
Ja.
Dass sie auf dich zurückkommen werden wird, um diese ästhetische Theorie herauszugeben.
Ach so.
Ja, das war, but it didn't happen.
Nee, also ich weiß nicht warum nicht, aber ich glaube, so Gretel selber war überfordert. Ne?
Ja, she committed
So
suicide.
neither
she
the
wrote
dissertation
a little
nor
bit
the aesthetic
after.
theory were finished at the time Adorno died, and his widow said she might consult Elisabeth, but evidently this didn't happen.
She was.
Maybe because she was
She had
simply
bad
overcome with
conscious,
many
I
things.
think, because of the last moments in Adorno's life. He was waiting for a letter from his
Friend.
girlfriend.
Utah? Oder?
No,
No.
and no.
Theodor was a good friend. That was important for me.
Sprich besser Deutsch.
Ja, ja. Also, es war so, dass selbst dass der Tod Adornos damit wahrscheinlich zusammenhängt, ne? Mit dieser Frau. Kann ja auch nichts dafür.
Mit wem? Mit was?
Ach,
Mit seiner jugendlichen Geliebten,
Ach so.
von der er
Speaking about
irgendwelche...
Adorno's lover.
Ja, eben. Ich meine.
Which appears in the correspondence.
Can I get a book from you right now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. I have more in the car.
More people need to have one.
Do we wanna?
Anybody else have a question or comment? There's some who haven't spoken, maybe, or something you'd like to ask or contribute, yes?
I have many questions, but I'll do my most casual. I'm interested in the process of thinking about biography and theory. It's interesting that this is a collection of correspondence and letters, and we're thinking about history of Adorno's life too. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of putting together this book and pondering someone who you know personally as it relates to theory. So I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of biography and personal self in theory in Surrealism, if there is anything to say about that, if that makes any sense.
Also die Frage ist, wie Leben und Theorie eigentlich zusammengeht.
Ja.
Sowohl im Surrealismus, aber auch in dem Erarbeiten dieses Buches.
Ja. So Leben und Theorie. Nö. Ich würde wirklich sagen, dass in dem Fall war das zwar, wir haben uns immer wieder verständigt, aber es war eigentlich, es war kein Zusammengehen. Ne?
Mit Adorno meinst du?
Nee, ja. Also,
Von Theorie und Praxis, das ist das Problem immer.
Ja.
It's an eternal problem.
Yes.
How to align theory and practice.
ja, für alle.
It's in every epoch, for every generation, it's a problem, I think, and it has to be solved anew.
I mean, from the
But with
perspective of
Adorno,
the...
it was that it didn't, so life and practice didn't come together, but life and theory didn't come together actually, in that case.
Nicht, aber zum Beispiel dieses Paris ist ja durch mich so für ihn aufgewertet worden. Der war vorher nicht in Paris, der reiste überall rum, aber sehr gern, vor allen Dingen in Österreich. Ne? Da war er sehr gern. Und dann plötzlich war er auch öfter in Paris. Das war
Und traf Beckett.
Wie?
He was originally maybe not that many connections to Paris, but he found an excuse to come then more often, and he often met Beckett in Paris, so there's a connection there.
Because
There is a pathway between life and theory.
I mean, I can only say in terms of the coming together of the book, as the translator initially and then the editor later on, the hardest part is always to get the tone right of the relationships. And it's particularly tricky we had a controversy actually with the publisher about whether or not in the beginning of the book he should be writing to you as Mrs. Lenk, because in German it's Frau Lenk. Yeah? And so we had to have a whole conversation about the fact that Ms. in English is now the term with which you respect a woman who is not a married woman, you know, and you're not talking about her status. So you wouldn't say Mrs. Lenk, you would say Ms. Lenk, right? And so we had to have a whole conversation about getting that right, and how to talk
But
about.
I was geschieden.
Yeah, no,
She was
at the
separated,
beginning
yeah,
he congratulates you to the
But we had
marriage.
to put
Ja.
a footnote.
Yeah.
Ja, das ist der Beginn. Ja, stimmt. Erstmal, aber ich habe mich ja schon nach einem Jahr wieder geschieden. Ich meine, das hat Adorno auch nichts mit zu tun.
Yeah.
Das war meine ganz persönliche Entscheidung.
So it's tricky as a biographer, I think, you know, to get the personal relationships right, not just the facts, right? And you know how to express that in a way which is respectful of the people, particularly if you happen to know them.
Yeah.
Well, Adorno's amorous tone certainly comes through in the letters. So I
In the
think
two
he-
letters.
in
that
the
he
do
wrote, yes.
letters.
Yeah, the do letters, right.
Ah ja, sie ist ja Spezialistin. Doch, wirklich, sie ist nämlich, weil sie sehr gut auch entziffern kann. Und mein Freund, der hat auch die wichtigsten Sachen entziffert.
Oh yeah, I'm going to tell the story now.
Yeah.
Yes, may I tell the story?
Yeah.
Okay. Everybody always asks me, did Elisabeth actually not have an affair with Adorno? People seem to have a hard time believing this. Although I find it not at all difficult to believe myself. But the reason that we know that this is true is because that when Adorno wrote these two letters, which he did not write, mostly his secretary wrote, he dictated to his secretary, but that these two letters, which are written to her suddenly using the personal pronoun do, yeah, and they're much more intimate, and they talk about how she's maybe the ideal woman and these things. And but Elisabeth couldn't read his handwriting, so she gave the letter to her partner to read out loud to her. And now we
Die Sache, dass Fritz für dich den Brief entziffern musste, diesen Liebesbrief.
Ich musste meinen Freund entziffern, ja, das stimmt.
genau.
Weil der konnte diese Sütterlin.
Und der hat ihm das dann vorgelesen.
Ja.
Ja, na klar, weil ich ja wissen wollte, weil ich natürlich wissen wollte, was in dem Brief steht. Ne? Ich konnte das
And what was his reaction?
Sütterlin kann ich nicht lesen.
Ja, wie hat der Fritz darauf reagiert?
Nur der Fritz, der musste immer ein bisschen lächeln. Ne?
Yeah, he was smiling. It was
No,
smiling.
because Adorno was bösartig, what's that?
Mean?
Mean-spirited?
Ja.
Fritz, he's Meyer, and he was a bookist, he was a seller of old books. And in Paris, yeah. He was an immigrant too, and he always said, say hello to Mr. Cohn.
Yeah, he never got his name right. He just picked a sort of, generic German Jewish name for him. Yeah.
Sind so Kleinigkeiten.
Sind alle.
I wanted to ask about the automatic writing. When you were talking about that, I thought immediately on Rimbaud and his Illuminations, and I was thinking that if surrealism was born out of the First World War or out of war.
Yeah, no, and of modern poetry, as I mentioned before. Rimbaud has played an important role for surrealism, and not only for surrealism, also for expressionism and the other avant-gardist movements. And the other one was Lautréamont. With Lautréamont, they discovered Lautréamont. Lautréamont at the time was absolutely unknown, and it was Philippe Soupeau who found a book on the in Paris, an den Seineufern da.
You know these old book bookinistes.
And
antiquarian booksellers have these little booths on the river.
One of the sources of surrealism, and it was already Lautréamont who wrote with a velocity that it's not üblich, it's not usual. No.
Yeah, I was just thinking as Rimbaud and Baudelaire were sort of reacting to the experience of the metropolis and of the bustling city, right? How that could be something similar to the reaction of war, or if they were in some sort of relationship.
Yeah, for Rimbaud particularly, because he was in Paris. He went to Paris as a young man. He was still at school, and he experienced the Pariser Commune, like yeah.
No.
I think we've got this.
And we should take the opportunity to thank
können
you
doch einfach
very, very much and transition into a Kaffee und Kuchen
übergehen.
Ja, es gibt weiter Gelegenheit, Sie anzusprechen und zu fragen und Ihnen zu danken ganz herzlich.